Guys, we are getting into it here. Chapter 10, we're going to do performance management and appraisal. And the big idea of this chapter is to figure out what is the process by which we evaluate someone's performance, wins and losses, right? Some of them, if you've ever had a performance evaluation that was good and it was helpful, then you know that. And if not, which is most of them, they're not particularly strong. So we're going to try to walk through that. And kind of the one things I want you to make sure that you get is that there isn't one way that works for every job, right? There are some main principles that we try to do universally, but not one method because jobs are different and performance feedback is kind of different. So we'll walk through it. There was a book written quite a while ago by a guy named Robert Kelly. It was called How to Be a Star at Work. And so he basically lays out this argument that politics is something that people usually look at in a bad light, like schmoozing, brown nosing, stuff like that. But politics, specifically relationships, are how things get done in an organization, in what we call the informal organization. So if you see someone politicking and they get their way, someone might go, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put my head down and I'm going to do my job and I'm going to go to work. Well, that's fine. You can do that. You're just losing at that particular strategy called politicking. So I'm not saying it's what we should strive toward, but if we're doing well in our job, we should bear in mind that that is, in many ways, how things end up getting done. So when we're in class, in a face-to-face class, I'll tell students sometimes, go ahead and evaluate my performance, and I don't really care what it is, but just come up with a reason why. And inevitably, they'll come up with a couple things, usually because there's social bias involved, a couple things that they like. And they'll say, oh, it's good or something like that. I'll go, okay, why? And they'll say, well, you keep me awake in class, or it makes me get up early so I come to class, or something like that. And I try to highlight the point that when you're giving someone performance feedback, if you give them what's called trait-based feedback, that is something about themselves versus something that they do, then it's not really helpful. If you go to an employee and say, hey, you're marked down on your performance because you have a bad attitude. Okay, thanks a lot, buddy. Like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Or you're marked down late on your performance because you're not really engaged. Classic word. What does that even mean? But if you say you're marked down because you come in late to work on average 3 days a week, between 5 and 15 minutes late, and just sends a message you don't want to be here, then at least you've got to something behavioral, that is, that the person's actually doing, which they can then adjust their behavior. Same thing, I mean, we talk about it in a work relationship, but same thing in any relationship. If I come home, my wife and I are in a disagreement, and she says, or I say something like, oh, well, you always do that. Well, that's not really helpful. Or you have a bad attitude about, whatever we do for the holidays. That's not helpful either. The more you can get behavioral, and especially if you can get results with behavior, then people can actually adjust their performance. So if you come home and your roommate's left a mess all over and you say, like, I'm moving out because you're a slob, that's not really behavioral. But if you say, this stuff that's all over the ground, the dirty dishes, whatever it is, then okay, they can actually make a connection between those things. One of those, just criticizing them, allows us to blow off steam. Sure, I see that. But if you actually want to change behavior, which is a major component of management, right, is managing performance, then you're going to have to get a lot more specific. The major issue that we see in this whole discipline of performance management has to do with error. So there's these guys that have done what's called a meta-analysis. They've done it multiple times, and they set out to answer the question, on average, are managers accurate? Do they actually evaluate performance that's consistent with the performance of their employees? And they found out, depending on which study you look at, it's about 90% error, which I think some people know that, but I want that to sink in, that your salary, your promotion, your firing, your layoff, all that stuff is determined with 90% error. And it leaves us the question of, if they're not accurately evaluating performance on average, what is it that they are evaluating? And the answer, I think, is a relationship. You have a good relationship with your boss, that's really helpful. If you're good at your job, great. You have to do that. That's nuts and bolts, bread and butter. Like, you have to be able to deliver on your job. But if you deliver on your job and there's no relationship with your manager, it won't be as good as if you deliver on your job with a positive relationship with your manager. All kinds of problems in it. We'll go through a bunch of these. One of them is called procedural justice. That is, people have kind of innately a right, or at least they believe they do, to know what they're being evaluated on and what the procedures were for their evaluations. Standards have to be clear, communicated in advance. I couldn't come to the end of class and say, well, here's your grade, and not ever tell you how I'm grading you. We would say that's probably not very fair. The instruments get really complex. That creates a problem for managers using them as well as employees trying to interpret them. And the final one there, number 5, is people ought to have input into the process, meaning, yes, you're my manager, but you don't actually know my job. So let me explain to you what I think the hardest parts or the most value-added parts of my job are, and that should be accounted for in the process. So lots of problems. It's complex always when you're dealing with people, and when you do performance management, you're almost making a statement about them, right? If they work 50, 60 hours a week at this job and you say you're good or bad, it has a massive impact on their personal life. So at a macro level, when we talk about performance management, it's pretty clear, no rocket science here. Make it clear what the organization expects. Give people the tools that they need as well as feedback they need to do it, and give them a chance to do it. Part of performance management is documenting, did they do it or did they not do it? Why does that matter? Well, there's 2 main kind of umbrellas that we think about with performance management in terms of utility. One of them is administrative and one of them is developmental. From an administrative perspective, we have to document poor performance if we're going to fire someone, and how we're going to predict salary, stuff like that, if we're going to promote someone. And from a developmental side, we want to document what they're doing that's good and areas they need to improve, so we create stronger, more capable human capital. So both of those are happening at the same time, and they often get mixed. From a cultural perspective, there's some things. I made this mistake multiple times before I kind of started to catch on here, is that the way that people are evaluated has significant cultural undertones. And I don't want you to think about this like, okay, great, so if I go to South Korea, I have to be careful how I do performance management. No, because you probably have a South Korean on your team. It's not just out there, outside the United States. It's in here because we have a multicultural workforce. So a few things. One, it's uncommon in many cultures for managers to even give feedback. If your manager comes to you and says you're not doing a bad job, you would translate that as like, well, you hate me and I'm a worthless human, versus how I grew up. I mean, that was constant. Maybe how you grew up is, you do it right, good job. You do it not right, bad job. And it was, okay, they're not making a statement on my value as a human. They're just making a statement on this thing that I did. But it's culturally connected. Younger subordinates don't engage in joint discussions with their managers. There's a thing called power distance. I remember my PhD program, one of the directors there, this guy named was Song Lee. I mean, you could hang out with him. I remember one time I was walking through the halls, and I was like, good morning, Dr. Lee. And he didn't say anything. He just looks at me like how dare you just address me? Who do you think you are? You know, just, you can feel the distance, the social distance within and between levels in an organization. And so if I'm a manager and I'm working with someone from a culture of high power distance, and I say, hey, let's talk about your performance, it's going to be yes or no, sir, on average, or else it'll be devastating. The last one is criticism. I mentioned this, is not seen as useful feedback. Like, oh, okay, my manager's telling me to do these things different. What's hurt is my manager believes I failed. So this doesn't mean that we modify the whole system, but it means each person that we sit down with as a manager and give them performance feedback, try to develop them, we got to keep in mind that that person has a story, that person has a culture, and has a set of beliefs, and it requires some emotional intelligence, some social intelligence to read the environment as we go through this process of performance evaluation. So again, at a macro level, how do we know if we're geared toward a performance culture versus an entitlement culture? Performance culture will do a few things, and hopefully they'll do them really well. Number one, everybody knows what's expected of them. There's a whole research field on a thing called role clarity. That is, what is my job? What am I supposed to deliver? Not just behaviors, but actually outcomes. This is the value proposition of my job. So that should be clear. Goals, deadlines should be clear. I should get some feedback on that job so I know if I'm doing good or poor, so I can adjust my behavior. If my manager doesn't know that, or if I don't know how to take that feedback, some training involved, And the last one, and you see this a lot, especially in more bureaucratic structured institutions, there are no consequences of poor performance. I had a conversation with actually the president of the university last night about, well, like, basically, what do you think about tenure? I come from a private sector where tenure is no, like you contribute, you produce value, or you're not here, and it's different. It was interesting to hear his take on it. But the bottom line is, if you're going to have a performance-oriented culture, there has to be a consequence to poor performance. Otherwise, people don't believe it. It's just dead wood in the organization, and nobody respects it. Okay, how to measure it. There's a lot of different ways you can measure it. One of the things that you won't see on here very much, we know quality, quantity, timeliness, stuff like that. Depends on the job. One of the things that you won't see on there is usually ethics. I want to talk about this a little bit later, but we do a lot in a business school to try to get at the idea of personal ethics and business ethics, professional standards, not just legal standards, but actually moral standards. And you usually won't have that attached to a performance evaluation because there's such variance. So a manager says, you swear too much. You use the F word, to me that's unethical, and I mark you down for that, and it affects your performance. Well, if you're not in a sales job and you're in a back corner and nobody hears it and it doesn't create any tension, or maybe you are but everybody does it, somebody would say, well, hey, wait a second, that's not really fair that you project your personal sense of ethics on me. There's no professional standard. There's no universal agreed to norm there. So it just gets a little dicey. You can do it. Usually what I say is when you're firing someone for performance, it's pretty hard. It takes a while, and you have to have your ducks in a row from a documentation perspective. But if you're firing someone for ethics, if it's clean, or safety, those are usually a lot easier. They're not any more fun. Firing people isn't fun, but they're usually a lot easier. Let's talk about the nature of feedback. So I referenced this early on. There are 3 types of feedback. So when you sit down with someone in a performance evaluation exercise and you say you always want to sandwich it, right? It's not rocket science. Here's what's going really well. Point out don't say in general, you're doing well, but specific, right? Things they can take away. What you did on X project was good. They can make the connection. That was the right thing. So they can modify their performance accordingly. So you want to go positive, areas of development, positive. Everybody knows that. Just like if you're in disagreement with somebody, positive, challenge, positive. But there are 3 types of feedback that we can give, and one of them is trait. And that is just the traits that the person has. So, hey, you have a good attitude, or good teamwork, or you show a lot of initiative. That's not really helpful. Nobody can take that and then modify their behavior accordingly to have better performance. Rather than saying you have good teamwork, you might say you don't miss meetings. You show up to meetings on time and you're prepared for your presentation. All your PowerPoints or your documents are submitted beforehand, stuff like that. So those are more behaviors that someone can go, oh, okay, these meetings I haven't done that, these I have, so I can modify my behavior. You can go all the way to results. That's more difficult, but you can say because your information was there, the team was able to make a decision in a 2-hour discussion and not a 2-week committee. That saved us X amount of time and dollars. Good job. So the further you can go down on this list, the better. This is, in my view, one of the biggest challenges for managers, because especially when you're rating 10, 15 people's performance, it's so much easier just to go right to trait. Oh, Joe, he's kind of a lazy bum. So you figure out some clever words instead of lazy, and you tell Joe he's a lazy bum. It's not really helpful. You got to tell Joe why. Why do you think that? What behaviors does he do that makes you think Joe is a lazy bum, and how does it affect the business? That's the results. So therefore, he can at least have a chance to modify his behavior. Standards. I just want to get the slide up here to make sure we get the standards. Come from the job analysis. We covered this earlier. That little document, assuming it's up to speed and consistent with the year that you're in, because sometimes they expire, is really important, because that's not only what a judge and a jury is going to go to, but it's also a fairness issue with the employee. These are what we said are these behaviors or these outcomes are good performance, and these are bad performance, and yours is obviously whatever it is, X or Y. So it's documented, it's steady. And this shows that it's not made up on the spot by a manager. Well, I just changed these performance evaluations and marked this person down. That's not okay. It has to be anchored. It's an issue of what's called procedural justice. Here's an example that we might see. on a particular criteria. So the performance level you can see on the left, superior, acceptable, needs improvement, and then lists of behaviors on the right. Not lists of traits, but list of behaviors on the right. These are the things that we do that generate needs improvement, acceptable, or superior performance. If you have something like this, if you don't create it, this is something we show with employees, not when we sit down for performance evaluations, but so they know in advance. This is what good performance is and what it isn't, so they can modify their behavior accordingly. I mentioned this with ethics. It's not usually up there. Sometimes, if it's in clear ethical roles, especially if you deal with like a CEO, insider trading, something like that. But that's really a legal issue at that point, not an ethical issue. As I said, two major umbrellas. So this one exercise, some people break it up twice a year, but this one exercise is useful for two things. There's an administrative role. We have to have this documentation, this evaluation to back up our business decisions. And then the other one is a developmental role. That is, where are you going next? What training or development opportunities do you need? Stuff like that. Coaching, mentoring, you can see it. So what some firms have done, and this is more work for the manager, but if you're a first line manager, you already know everything floats up to you and everything is pushed down to you. So it's a very tough job, fun job, but tough job. Then what some firms have done is taken this, rather than saying, hey, we're going to do this once a year, they'll say we're going to do this twice a year. One time is going to be for the administrative piece, that is your pay, compensation, and the other one is going to be for development, making you better, stronger as an employee. The reason we might separate those is because if I sit down with my boss who's talking to me about my performance, I might have only one question. Am I getting a raise, and if so, how much? Like that's it. And so you can talk about development all you want and how I'm doing in my career. And I just think, dude, I don't care. Am I going to get a raise? So by separating these two, meeting times, if you will, these two processes, there at least can be a little bit more of a discussion around getting better as an employee and improving.